Good day. Yesterday, at the start of my program, I spent a considerable amount of time discussing the Ukrainian raid into Belgorod, the apparent attempt to attack and capture some Russian border villages, perhaps in order to distract attention away from the defeat in Bakhmut and to raise morale within Ukraine itself, perhaps also to try to get the Russians to divert troops from more critically important parts of the front line to defend Belgorod itself, perhaps also an attempt by Ukraine to raise civilian morale within Ukraine itself, where obviously the news from Bakhmut will have come as a significant blow. Though I ought to say that at the time of making of this program, Ukraine has sort of not denied that the Russians have captured Bakhmut, but there's been no official announcement, no positive, straightforward admission that Bakhmut is indeed under Russian control. Well, as the hours progressed, we got confirmation from the Russian Defense Ministry, or at least the Russian Defense Ministry claimed that the incursion had been repelled with heavy losses, and that the troops, the Ukrainian troops who participated in this operation, had been driven back to Ukrainian territory. Now, the Russian Defense Ministry issued a statement, published a statement, which it then embedded later on in its greater summary, larger summary of the events of the 23rd of May. I'm going to, across the entire battle fronts, I'm going to just read what it said, what it says, just to give an idea of what the overall situation in terms of this Belgorod attack was, as discussed by the Russians. They say, and this is, as I said, I want to stress again, this is a Russian statement, the Kiev regime defeated in Artyomivsk, that's to say Bakhmut, but from now on I'm going to slowly start to refer to the place as Bakhmut, at least when we're speaking about it as a town, rather than as a battle. I think the Battle of Bakhmut has now become so widely used and accepted, including in Russia itself, by the way, that when I refer to the battle, I'm going to continue to use the name Bakhmut. But anyway, let's return to what the Russian Defense Ministry says. The Kiev regime, defeated in Artyomivsk, started to carry out terrorist attacks. This is the Russian Defense Ministry's account, let me repeat, against civilians. On 22nd May this year, after the intense shelling of the Kazinka International Checkpoint, as well as a number of other civilian facilities in the Grayvoron district of Belgorod region, a unit of a Ukrainian nationalist formation entered the territory of the Russian Federation. Now, the point about it being a Ukrainian nationalist formation is important because Ukraine itself and the media in the West largely have gone along with the fiction, and I'm afraid it is a fiction, that the people who attacked this border post were in fact anti-Russian, anti-Putin Russian partisans. And I've seen headlines in British media, articles in the British media talking about the anti-Russian, anti-Putin Russian partisans involved in this attack. And there's even been an extraordinary article about how for President Putin and his government, it would be a nightmare that finally Russians have risen up and have taken up arms against his supposedly hated regime. Well, the Russian authorities want to make it absolutely clear that this was an incursion by a Ukrainian unit, military unit, and as a matter of fact, the Russian authorities have gone further and have said, separately from this statement, that every single individual that they have so far identified who participated in this operation, every single individual who was killed or captured, and the Russians do claim to have captured several people, as we will see. Anyway, all of them have been Ukrainian citizens. And note also the expression nationalist formation, which suggests again that this is not exactly a unit of the regular Ukrainian army, but rather a group of people, a unit drawn from these formations, which are now part of the Ukrainian armed forces, though one gets the sense that they're to some extent a law unto themselves, and which have strong ideological perspectives, and which are organized in particular brigades, and who, by the way, make up some of Ukraine's best troops. And Russian media reporters have identified the forces involved in this incursion as having been drawn from the Azov Brigade and the Kraken unit, both of which have particular reputations in Russia, which I'm not going to discuss further in this program. Anyway, the Russian Ministry of Defense then goes on to say, in the course of the counter-terrorist operation, as a result of airstrikes, artillery fire and active action by units of the Western Military District that cover the state border, the nationalist formations have been blocked and destroyed. The remaining nationalists were pushed back into Ukraine, where they continued to be hit until they had been completely eliminated. The enemy losses were over 70 Ukrainian terrorists. Notice the use of the description terrorists to describe these soldiers, though undoubtedly they were part of, well, shall we say, formal military formations. 4 armoured vehicles and 5 pickup trucks. The armed forces of the Russian Federation continue the special military operation. And then we get a long description of what's going on elsewhere on the battlefronts. So the Russians give the impression that most of these people were killed. They give the impression that 70 have been, enemy losses were 70. We know that some of these people were captured, and I suspect that figure 70 is a ballpark figure for both dead and captured on the other side, which gives us some idea of the size of this operation. It appears to have been at company strength, say around 100 men. So not a big operation by any means. But anyway, according to the Russians, it totally failed. And by the way, Russian authorities, the other Russian authorities, have suggested that the Russian armed forces, that's to say the military, the border guards, who are controlled by the FSB, the Russian Counterterrorism and Internal Security Agency, and some police and National Guard formations that also participated in this fight, this firefight, that they suffered no losses at all. Whether or not that's true, I can't, of course, say. And anyway, some, as I said, of these men have been, Ukrainian troops have been captured, others have been killed. Ukrainian losses overall were 70. But according to the Russian Defense Ministry statement, they've all been driven out of Russia. Well, the latter, by the way, might not be entirely true, because since then we've had a statement from Vyacheslav Gladkov, who is the Russian regional governor, elected regional governor of Belgorod region. And he said, he's reported as saying the following. He says more than 550 people from the Graivoronsky district are staying at temporary accommodation centers in Stary Oskol, Rakitnoye, Ivna and Stroitel. I also hope that you will be able to return to your homes as soon as law enforcement officers are done mopping up the area. So what does mopping up mean? Does that mean that they think that there are still possibly some Ukrainian fighters still loose? But possibly. I think it's highly likely. I'm guessing that there's also some checks to see that they haven't left explosive devices and other things behind them. But overall, it does seem to me that one can say with a certain measure of confidence that this particular incident has ended. The unit, this Ukrainian unit, tried to break into Belgorod. It didn't penetrate at all far from the border. The Russian border guards, police, National Guard and border guard units were all activated rapidly. They quickly brought the situation under the control, and the Ukrainians were driven back. And Ukraine suffered losses, not perhaps huge losses relative to the state of the fighting in the war as a whole. But I come back to what I was saying yesterday. Whoever ordered this operation, be it Zelensky or one of his officials, perhaps Budanov, who many think has some kind of sway over the operation of these nationalist units in the Ukrainian armed forces. Whoever ordered this operation seems to have been remarkably heedless of the lives of the men who participated in it. Never mind the civilians. Apparently no civilians were killed, several were wounded. However, at least again, that's what the Russian authorities would have us believe. So, whoever it was, as I said, who ordered this operation, seems to have been very heedless of human life, including the lives of their own soldiers. And I have to say, whatever political or psychological or propaganda purpose this operation served, given its predictable and total failure, it hardly seems to me worth trading lives to achieve it. In terms of its propaganda value, I don't know what impact it's had in Ukraine itself. My guess is that by now the Ukrainian population has probably become very jaded and cynical about operations of this kind. But in the West, there's been little comment about this incident. And one of the reasons why there has been little comment about this incident is because, of course, the Russians, as the Ministry of Defense has just told us, captured or destroyed 4 armored fighting vehicles and 5 pickup trucks. There's also some reports that a tank was also involved in this operation and that it too has been destroyed, but I've seen no pictures of it. But of the 4 armored fighting vehicles and 5 pickup trucks, pictures of them have appeared, and they are American. They're of American production and American supply to Ukraine. Now, why is that important? The reason it is important is because the United States, the US authorities, repeatedly and incessantly tell us that the Ukrainians are only supplied American equipment in return for categorical undertakings that they will not use this American equipment to carry out strikes on Russian territory itself. Now, the United States has, by the way, repeatedly made known, this goes all the way back to the summer, that as far as it is concerned, Crimea is not Russian territory, so Crimea is not covered by this prohibition. Jake Sullivan said this again a couple of days ago, and I think a lot of people, especially in Russia, picked this up and thought that he was somehow green-lighting Ukrainian attacks on Crimea. That is absolutely correct, but he gave that green light months ago. So there's nothing new in that statement that Jake Sullivan made. But the US authorities have always said that US equipment is provided to Ukraine on the basis that it will not be used for attacks on Russia within its pre-2014 borders. And now we have just seen an attack on Russia carried out by Ukraine. I've no doubt it was Ukraine, carried out within Russia's pre-2014 borders with US equipment being used. So, what is the response from the United States? Well, absolute silence. Basically, they continue to go along with the fiction that this wasn't the Ukrainian military at all. These were anti-Russian partisans. They're pretending to doubt these photos of these destroyed American vehicles. They say they have no reason to think that American equipment was used in this kind of attack. Certainly, there's no word that US officials have been on the phone to Kiev asking anxiously about what happened. There's no word that there's any criticism of Ukraine for what it has done. And I have to say that these attempts, I should make it clear, by the way, that in my opinion, these photographs of these American vehicles speak for themselves. I have no doubt at all that they were used in these attacks, that these photographs of these vehicles, of these destroyed vehicles, are of the vehicles which were used by these attacks, and they are clearly American vehicles. Well, here we have yet another example of the United States, of the Biden administration, saying one thing and winking, basically, as the opposite happens. They say that American equipment should not be used for attacks on Russian territory. Ukraine says it has promised that it will not use American equipment for attacks on Russian territory. The equipment is supplied, Ukraine uses it for attacks on Russian territory, and the United States says nothing and gives every impression that it is not particularly concerned. And this pretense is echoed right across the collective West. Nobody seems at all worried about Western weapons being used in this kind of way. Now, this is a massive break with precedent. There have been many proxy wars between the United States and Russia, between the United States and the Soviet Union in the past. The Soviets, for example, provided extensive weapons to North Korea during the Korean War. Soviet pilots fought in fighter jets supplied to North Korea and engaged with American fighters fighting in the Korean War. The Soviets also supplied large quantities of equipment and machines, surface-to-air missiles, tanks, fighter jets, radars, all that kind of thing, to the North Vietnamese during the Vietnam War. And of course, some of that equipment was also used against the US, especially the US Air Force. And some years ago, admissions trickled out of Moscow that Soviet technicians and advisors, so-called, were involved in operating some of the surface-to-air missiles, the SAM-2 missiles, S-25 missiles, as the Russians refer to them, which were used by the North Vietnamese to shoot down US bombers. But at no point in time did the Soviets supply weapons to any proxy which were intended for use on the territory of the continental United States itself. That was an absolute taboo. And by the way, the United States did the same. The United States, for example, supplied weapons to the Afghan fighters fighting the Soviets in Afghanistan in the 1980s, but there was never any suggestion that those fighters would try to cross the border into the Soviet Union and launch attacks on, say, Soviet aircraft within the Soviet Union itself. As I said, that was well understood on both sides, that that was an absolute taboo. This administration, this Biden administration, does not observe that taboo. It is perfectly happy with attacks by Ukraine using American equipment within Russia itself. And this is not the first occasion when that's happened. It's been pointed out, for example, that the recalibration of the Strij Soviet-era surveillance drone into a kind of cruise missile could not have happened without technical support from the Western powers. And of course, Ukraine was only going to use that missile in order to launch deep strikes into Russia, which did in fact happen, though those deep strikes have essentially come to an end. But anyway, there we go. So that's a taboo that has been broken, and the Biden administration seems quite unfazed by the fact. One gets the sense that it wants to see it broken. It likes it to happen. Now, I find this extremely disturbing and very ominous, and I do wonder whether a precedent has been set which might in time be used in all sorts of ways, which I don't want to speculate about on this program. But I will say something else, which is that once again, the Biden administration pretending that American weapons are supplied purely on guarantee that they will not be used to carry out attacks on Russian territory, and then looking the other way when attacks are made on Russian territory using precisely that sort of equipment, and then going on to supply more equipment in the knowledge that that equipment has been used in the past and no doubt will be used in the future to carry out more attacks on Russian territory. Well, all that does is that it further undermines trust between the great powers, between the Russians and the Americans in this case. The Russians see that to use a simple word, the Americans are lying. And given that the Americans are lying, and this has been a long-running concern that the Russians have had about their interactions with every single US administration going all the way back to the Clinton era, but most especially with the Biden administration, that is going to make any negotiations, any attempts to try and sort out negotiations between the Americans and the Russians, be it over Ukraine or over any other issue, extremely difficult, perhaps even impossible. How do the Russians negotiate with a party which continuously lies to them? No one in Washington, at least no one in the administration, seems to understand that. Nor do they understand that, or so it seems to me, in connection with their relations with China. We've just had an incredibly aggressive, incredibly confrontational statement from the G7 about China. The Financial Times, as I discussed in a recent video, spoke about it as the harshest statement about China the G7 has ever published. And yet we had a press conference in which we had President Biden talking absurdly about a rapidly approaching thaw in relations between China and the United States. And there have already been commentaries about this in the Chinese media. There's one in Global Times. They're saying this is again in complete contradiction. The United States says one thing, it says it wants something completely different. How can we trust people who talk to us or talk about us in this way? And I've never known this. I mean, I have to say the United States has always been, for countries that have to interact with it, and this has been true throughout my lifetime, a difficult country in many respects to interact with. But I have never known a collapse in straightforwardness and honesty such as has taken place in American diplomacy since this particular administration took office in January 2021. Anyway, that is all I'm going to say about this Belgorod incident. In my opinion, it's the last point, the fact that American weapons were used, and quite ostentatiously used. The Ukrainians have lots of other trucks that they could have used for this, Soviet-era trucks, whatever it was that you like, but they chose to use American ones. Anyway, the fact that this was done in this kind of way, with American equipment, that for me is the single most important thing about this episode. It's the one that the Russians have noticed and are taking most seriously, and the Russian media is full of discussion about it. Anyway, what's happening elsewhere on the battlefronts? Well, there was some contradictory talk about the situation around Bakhmut yesterday. I say contradictory talk, not very much from Ukraine, quite a lot from the Russians, but we have two completely different versions of events. Well, not perhaps completely different versions. One was from Redovka. They suggested that the Russians are now on the attack west of Bakhmut. They say that the Russians have made attempts to advance in the area of Grigorievka, which is a town somewhat to the north of Bakhmut, where Ukraine had launched an offensive, part of its offensive some weeks ago, that the Russians are busy trying to recapture ground there, and that the Russians have also attacked in the direction of Ivanivska, though so far without success. Boris Rozhin, the commentator who writes as Colonel Kassad, has had a slightly different story. He says that Bakhmut is completely secure. There is no possibility of a Ukrainian attack on Bakhmut at any point in time, but the Ukrainians are still trying to make advances on the flanks, though without any success, though he does say that there are still some troops, Ukraine still has some troops in reserve in the area that it could deploy to the area. He also speculates that the Russians might go on the attack in this area at some point, but he also says that the weather conditions have again deteriorated. There is once more lots of rain, and that makes movement of men and machines difficult, and therefore the offensive actions by either side have ground to a stop. Well, as I said, they're not exactly, to put it mildly, the same reports. And of course, as I repeat again, I am not on site. I don't know exactly what is going on around Bakhmut. But I suspect that there's an element of truth to both accounts. I think that the Ukrainians perhaps have made the odd counterattack in one or two places. I suspect that the Russians have also launched probing attacks, especially towards Ivanivska. I doubt that either side is making any serious effort to advance in and around Bakhmut. The Russians, after all, are going to carry out a rotation of troops soon. The Wagner forces are going to be pulled back to the rear to rest and re-equip and have their forces reinforced with new fighters. We'll come to that in a moment. And the Ukrainians, for their part, are drawing back and trying to consolidate following the disastrous loss of Bakhmut. So I suspect that this is true. And of course, the rain no doubt does make things rather more complicated. So that's the situation around Bakhmut. We've also had some other statements from Denis Pushilin, who is the acting head of the Donetsk regional government and who, by the way, recently visited Bakhmut. He has said that it will retain the future name of in the future its old Soviet name of Artyomsk. He's also said that the settlement of New York, there is such a place, which is close to Donetsk, once it's captured, its name also will revert to its Russian name. It will no longer be called New York. And he talks about the eventual reconstruction of Bakhmut and such things. But he's also spoken about the situation in other parts of the battlefronts. He said this in a live broadcast today on Solovyov Live television channel. He said, I have no special concern over Avdiivka and Marinka as guys with combat experience from the 1st Army Corps are positioned there. The situation is under control. In Marinka, we do not yet see any active operations to push them out. That's to say, to push the Ukrainians out. Whereas in Avdiivka, we see actually daily improvement of positions. In other words, the Russians are standing still. In Marinka, they're not making any attempt to push back, to push the Ukrainians out of what part of Marinka is left, but they are still continuing to advance in the Avdiivka area. He says the enemy made attempts to counterattack in the Marinka area, but these attacks were all neutralized. And I suspect that's true. But anyway, that's the only other information we're getting about events on the battlefronts. And what about other things? Well, we've now had some more statements about Prigozhin, about the fighting in Bakhmut. First thing I'd say, and I think it's in some ways the most important, is that he has again repeated that the Battle of Bakhmut was not intended originally to result in the capture of the place. It was intended to ground the Ukrainian army down. The capture of Bakhmut has turned out, in a sense, to be, from a Russian point of view, an unexpected bonus. It was not the original plan, but it was the way, if you like, things turned out. And we've had I think, rather good discussion of that element of this battle from General Douglas Macgregor. Now, he's done lots of programs about this, but he's also done an interesting article for the American Conservative. I would say that there's been some comments about Douglas Macgregor. People have pointed out that, like Scott Ritter, he made predictions of a rapid Russian victory at the start of the war, which were not fulfilled, and people have criticized his military understanding of the war in consequence. In my opinion, General Macgregor's, and by the way, Scott Ritter's military assessments tend to be largely accurate. What people perhaps are overlooking is that neither man could have understood the political constraints that operated on Russian decision-making at the start of the war, which explains why the Russians, in the first few months of the war, basically pulled their punches. They weren't seeking at that time an outright victory, the kind of outright victory that Ritter and Macgregor thought they were. They were seeking instead a negotiated settlement of the conflict, which they came very close to achieving in the talks that took place in Istanbul at the end of March 2022. I just want to say that because I have nonetheless, despite those earlier predictions, found both Scott Ritter and Macgregor to be extremely sound commentators about the military side of the war, something which, of course, I don't have the grasp, the expertise, the background in military matters to share this kind of feel for what goes on the battlefields that military professionals like Scott Ritter, Douglas McGregor, Brian Beletic, Daniel Davis, people like that all have. Anyway, this is what McGregor says, and I'm going to quote him here. I'm going to quote this article because I think it captures this very well. He says, until fighting begins, national military strategy developed in peacetime thinking about warfare in its objectives. Thinking about warfare, shapes thinking about warfare and its objectives. Then fighting creates a new logic of its own. Strategy is adjusted, objectives change. The battle for Bakhmut illustrates this point very well. And he then discusses General Surovikin. He says, when General Surovikin assumed command of the Russian military in Ukraine last year, President Putin and his senior military advisors concluded that their original assumptions about the war were wrong. Washington had proved incurably hostile to Moscow's offers to negotiate, and the ground force Moscow had committed to compel Kiev to negotiate had proved too small. Surovikin was given wide latitude to streamline command relationships and reorganize the theatre. Most importantly, Surovikin was also given the freedom of action to implement a defensive strategy that maximized the use of standoff, attack or strike systems, whilst Russian ground forces expanded in size and striking power. The Bakhmut meat grinder was the result. And Bakhmut meat grinder, Operation Bakhmut meat grinder, is, we now know, the name that was actually given to this operation by Surovikin. Prigozhin has told us this. And then McGregor goes on to say, when it became clear that Ukraine's President Zelensky and his government regarded Bakhmut as a symbol of Ukrainian resistance to Russian military power, Surovikin turned Bakhmut into the graveyard of Ukrainian military power. From the fall of 2022 onwards, Surovikin exploited Zelensky's obsession with Bakhmut to engage in a bloody tug of war for control of the city. As a result, thousands of Ukrainian soldiers died in Bakhmut and many more were wounded. And I think that is exactly how it turned out. As I said, I don't think the original plan was to capture Bakhmut at all, but that is how it also turned out once the grinding of Ukrainian forces in Bakhmut proved even more successful than perhaps Surovikin himself initially imagined. Now, that brings me to the topic of Prigozhin's latest comments. Now, please always remember that Prigozhin says many things. As I said, when he talks about capture of particular places, movement of forces in an area of which he has direct knowledge, then he is extremely reliable. When he talks about other things, he is often much less reliable. He was complaining, for example, about ammunition shortages. It was little sign that the operation in Bakhmut in its last days was seriously affected by ammunition shortages. He was worried about Ukrainian attacks on the flanks. Those attacks did take place, but they were repelled. He was worried that Bakhmut might be surrounded by the Ukrainian military. That never happened. He is a passionate, emotional man. He might have particular axes to grind with Russian military commanders. He is not always a reliable narrator of what happens over the course of the war, of any particular battle in the war. But nonetheless, he did say some very interesting things. He said that the total force, the Wagner force that was deployed in and around Bakhmut, numbered some 50,000 men. Now that, to me, probably sounds a bit exaggerated. He said that over the course of the entire fighting in Bakhmut, from the summer, the sort of midsummer of 2022 until its final capture, the Wagner forces suffered losses of 15,000 killed. However, of those 15,000 killed, only 5,000 were professional Wagner troops. And that's 5,000 out of 50,000 Wagner troops in total. That's a 10% kill rate. I would say that was extremely high, by the way, higher than is generally acceptable in NATO armies, though not, it must be said, an impossible one. He also said that he recruited, over the course of the fighting, some 50,000 convicts from prisons. And he said that 20% of them were killed, which would be 10,000, and 20% of them were wounded, which would be another 10,000. An exceptionally high rate of loss. Now, that gives us a total figure, people killed, according to Prigozhin, on the Russian side in the Battle of Bakhmut, of 15,000. He says that Ukrainian losses in people killed were more than 3 times that number. So if we accept the numbers that Prigozhin is giving us, then Ukraine suffered losses of around 50,000 killed in the fighting in Bakhmut. Now, note that Prigozhin tells us that 10,000 soldiers, 10,000 of the Russian soldiers who were killed in the fighting were convicts. I have some doubts about this number, and I'll say straightforwardly why. It is exactly the same number that John Kirby gave for convict losses short time ago, about 10 days ago. He said, as I remember, that 10,000 Russian convicts were killed in the fighting in Bakhmut. Prigozhin says, has given us exactly the same number. That does make me wonder that perhaps Prigozhin is taking that figure from Kirby. Or it could be that Kirby was right. I don't know. But anyway, overall, Prigozhin wants us to think that 5,000 Russian professional soldiers were killed in the battle, as opposed to 50,000 Ukrainian soldiers, fully equipped, fully trained soldiers, regular army soldiers were killed in the battle. This is a horrendous rate of loss. Now, I am going to accept his figure of 5,000 for the losses that the Wagner organization has suffered. 5,000 professional soldiers killed. I think that his other figures, I report them because they're interesting, but I don't place particularly great reliance on them, either on the number of men that Ukraine lost, killed. He says 50,000. That's his number. But as I said, I don't place a huge amount of reliance upon it. And I don't place very much reliance on the number he gives of convicts who were killed either. Now, I will qualify that by making 2 observations. Firstly, it's now known that in the winter, January, February, the Russian authorities became extremely concerned at the fact that Prigozhin had apparently been granted, by no less a person than Putin himself, carte blanche to recruit convicts from Russian prisons, and that the number of convicts he was recruiting was perhaps greater than the Russian authorities anticipated, and he was told to stop. And I wonder whether perhaps one of the reasons he was told to stop was because so many of these people were being killed. And I wonder whether perhaps there was behind the scenes a big row about this between the Russian military, who weren't happy at the way in which these people were being thrown into the battle and were being killed, and Prigozhin, who always pushes back when criticism is made of him. And I wonder whether this is part of the backstory in the famous arguments we've had about ammunition, about Gerasimov and Shoigu and all the rest. That's one thing I would say. And 50,000 killed Ukrainians. I don't know how many Ukrainians were killed, but I have seen figures of around 50,000 being floating around. And I know many people whose judgment on this I trust, who think that 50,000 killed in Bakhmut may actually be true. A devastating number of losses in a battle, in this particular battle. Now, Douglas McGregor, Andrew Karibko, all sorts of people, again, coming back with this claim that Bakhmut itself is of no great strategic significance. Again, I'm going to push back on this. I can remember back in the summer and the early autumn when, on the contrary, there were lots of reports about the fact that Bakhmut was of great strategic significance. Bakhmut suddenly stopped being significant strategically when it started to become clear that Ukraine was losing the battle for Bakhmut. And again, to reiterate, it lies at the center of a transport hub, the various railway lines that link up to Bakhmut. They have helped Ukraine up to now link together its various defense positions in Bakhmut. The fall of Bakhmut has deprived Ukraine of that ability. It's positioned the Russians where they can strike at various Ukrainian positions simultaneously if they choose. And of course, and perhaps most important of all, they make some of these railway systems now available for the Russians to use. They can repair these railways, they can move troops and supplies right into the center of the Donbass, positioning them in locations where they are now very close to the big cities of Kramatorsk and Slavyansk, where the major last big Ukrainian defense line is left. So that's what I'm going to say about this. Prigozhin's comments, as I said, they're always interesting, but I've learned over the last few weeks that they cannot be relied upon fully. The Operation Bakhmut meat grinder thing has enough external corroboration, including from Surovikin himself, to be reliable. And as I said, Prigozhin is reliable about advances and occasionally retreats, but he is not reliable about tactics or strategy or supplies or about which troops are participating in a particular battle. And I don't think he's enormously reliable about losses either. But it has attracted attention, what he has said, so I've thought that it might be as well to report it. Now, this all brings me to the next big topic, because what now happens next, and there's been more discussion now about the Ukrainian offensive. And there's been articles about it by Daniel Davis at 45 and up from others. growing doubts that this offensive can succeed. And I've noticed that there's been some more comments about this offensive again from the Ukrainians, including from Kirilo Budanov, the intelligence chief. Now, I'm getting the impression that the Ukrainians still do not want to conduct this offensive. And I wonder whether the promise of the F-16s is now going to give them another excuse to delay conducting this offensive until the F-16s finally appear. That might have been, from a Ukrainian point of view, the primary purpose of lobbying to get the F-16s. It's not so much to conduct the offensive. Even the Pentagon says that if the offensive is carried out now, the F-16s won't be there. So, it has no real bearing on the offensive itself. It is rather that Ukraine wants to string its allies along. It's not too keen on conducting an offensive, which it knows it will fail. Daniel Davis discusses this at length. He puts the number of Ukrainian troops available to conduct this offensive at around 30,000, a similar number by Douglas Macgregor. I think it's probably rather more than that, by the way. He points out, both Davis and Macgregor point out, the relatively limited number of tanks and machines and ammunition that Ukraine has, the enormous defenses the Russians have created, the size of the Russian forces. They're all skeptical that this offensive can succeed. So the Ukrainians have been talking about this offensive for months. They've said that they were about to launch it, and they've been stringing along their allies. They say, well, we will conduct this offensive when we get tanks, and they've been given the tanks. We will conduct this offensive when we get the infantry fighting vehicles, and they're given the infantry fighting vehicles. They now say that they need the F-16s. Perhaps they will be able to persuade their allies this time that really they should wait a few weeks or months for the F-16s to arrive, the next game-changer weapon, before they conduct this offensive. Now, I'm not sure that even if that is the Ukrainian plan, that this will hold. I'm getting the impression that there's growing exasperation, especially in Washington, about these Ukrainian delaying tactics. I think there's going to be intense pressure on Ukraine to get this offensive going as soon as possible. As I've already said in my previous programs, my interpretation of some of President Biden's words point very clearly and in that direction, that he wants the Ukrainians to get this offensive going as fast as possible. And I think that that is probably much more likely what is going to happen. But, as I said, doubts about this offensive do seem to exist on the Ukrainian side. And what happened with the Ukrainian offensive launched around Bakhmut might explain why. And that brings me to a further point. Now, as I have discussed in various programs, I have been extremely helpfully assisted by a particular person who has been in touch with me, who, though not a member of the Wagner organization himself, and I want to make that clear, does have access to information and has confirmed to me in ways that I consider reliable that he is in possession, that he is in contact with people who have who are actually involved in Wagner. And this person has told me a number of things. Firstly, he says that the Wagner force will be resting and re-equipping over the next few weeks. They will receive some armoured vehicles, most probably not, as I guessed, new boomerang wheeled vehicles, but more probably BMPs, infantry fighting vehicles, in other words, perhaps BMP-2s, rather lighter than the BMP-3s that are now becoming regular equipment within the Russian military. And he also said that the plan that the Wagner force will also be given a helicopter component operated by the Russian Air Force, by the Russian military itself. And anyway, it will become a somewhat more sophisticated unit in some respects. And he suggested that the Russians intend to use it in this forthcoming battle, which is coming, the Ukrainian offensive, as a kind of fire brigade force. If there's a Ukrainian penetration somewhere, Wagner troops, now highly experienced in war, will be thrown in to stop any offensive, any breakthrough, any incursion that the Ukrainians do manage to achieve, all of which is interesting. But this person has told me two further things, and I should say that this is based on interviews which this person has claimed to have had with people who are currently serving in the Wagner organization. He says that these people have told him two things. Firstly, that the size of the Russian forces that have been built up is even bigger than most people think. And that might be true. Prigozhin said that Wagner forces in particular are getting lots of volunteers. There's lots of reports that the Russian military, over and above the reservists who were called up back in September, has also been on a major recruitment exercise, that there are perhaps tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands more Russian troops in the theatre than has been widely reported. Who's to say? But he said something else, and that is that the Russians not only are now anxious for this Ukrainian counterattack to happen, they are confident that they can repel it and defeat it. But that one of the reasons they're anxious to have it happen is that once it's over and done with, they fully intend this time to go on the attack. Now, it's clear that the people who this person has been in touch with are not senior officers. We're not talking about General Gerasimov and Surovikin and General Lapin. By the way, whilst mentioning General Lapin, it seems that he was put in charge of countering this incursion into Belgorod region, which he seems to have done very efficiently. But anyway, we're not talking about the military high command. So it's far from certain, as I said, that these people, these soldiers, actually, we're probably almost certainly talking about soldiers, necessarily know what the Russian plan is. But that does seem to be the general feeling, the general wish, not just within the Wagner organization, but within large parts of the Russian regular army now deployed in Ukraine. The sentiment seems to be that this has gone on long enough, that they've been fighting, firstly, well, for many months now, an attrition battle. Once the Ukrainians attack, they would like finally to go on the attack themselves, and that will hopefully bring this war to an end. And Macgregor has the same view. He says there is no incentive to delay Russian offensive operations once Ukraine's offensive resources are exhausted. As Ukrainian forces repeatedly demonstrate, paralysis is always temporary. Infrastructure and equipment are repaired. Manpower is conscripted to rebuild destroyed formations. If Russia is to achieve its aim of demilitarizing Ukraine, Gerasimov surely knows he must still close with and complete the destruction of the Ukrainian ground forces that remain. Now, I don't know whether that is what Gerasimov thinks, and of course he may have information unknown both to McGregor and to the soldiers that my interlocutor is speaking with. And it may also be the case that the Russian military continues to be restricted in what it can do by the political directives they're getting from Putin himself. But it is a possibility. And I think we should also bear in mind that if this is the sentiment amongst the soldiers, that they're keen to go on the attack, that might have an influence on what happens in the future. Anyway, we will have to wait and see. So that's what I can say about the situation on the military side of the situation in the war today. Now, there's been quite a lot of other things going on, and the first thing to say is that Prime Minister Mishustin of Russia, who has been conducting his tour of China, has now had a meeting with President Xi Jinping of China in Moscow. The Chinese have not yet provided a complete readout, nor, by the way, have the Russians. But the Financial Times has provided a report, at least, and it says Xi Jinping has called for China and Russia to deepen trade, economic and energy ties as the Chinese leader shrugs off Western's pressure to reduce support for Vladimir Putin despite the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The Chinese president, who met Russian Prime Minister Mikhail Mishustin in Beijing on Wednesday, reaffirmed his support for Moscow's core interests and said Beijing was willing to expand new growth points in bilateral cooperation with Russia, according to China's foreign ministry. Mishustin told Xi that Russia and China stand together against the attempts of the collective West to maintain global dominance, to use illegal sanctions to impose their will on independent states, according to Interfax. Interfax is an independent Russian news agency. And we also have an extensive report about Mishustin's visit in Global Times, and it confirms that China-Russia trade will hit $200 billion this year. And that is a very big increase. It, as I said, makes Russian-Chinese trade, for the first time, a significant part of China's total trade. And it seems to be, this process seems to be accelerating. And as I said in my previous program, it is likely that $200 billion process figure will be exceeded this year. And Chinese experts have said that China and Russia are moving closer on economic cooperation, should not be associated with the ongoing Ukraine crisis, nor should be seen as China skewing towards certain party, calling such interpretation narrow-minded. They note that China has the right to choose who to work with as long as the collaboration does not violate international law norms, and such a choice won't be disturbed by noise from any third party. So the Americans might apply noise and criticism, but Chinese-Russian trade is going to continue to develop. Well, while Mishustin has been in China, Dmitry Medvedev, deputy chair of Russia's Security Council, the man in overall charge of Russia's defense industries, its military-industrial complex, he has been touring Southeast Asia. And he's recently been in Hanoi, in Vietnam, where he's met with the Vietnamese leadership. And apparently the Vietnamese and the Russians reaffirmed their long friendship with each other, which of course was sealed during the period of the Indochina Wars of the 1950s and 60s and 70s, and which has never gone away at any time since. So Medvedev has been building more links in Hanoi, even as Mishustin tours China. So we've had things like this taking place. And there have been other things of a similar nature going on in other places too. So, for example, the admiral of the Russian Navy, the chief of the Russian Navy, is now currently on a trip to Iran. And we have a report about this from the Russian Defense Ministry. Russian Navy Commander-in-Chief Admiral Nikolai Yevmenov pays official visits to Iran, and there's photographs of him with Iranian naval officers, and we read that during the meeting, naval cooperation and the exchange of experience between the two countries' navies was discussed. And I can't help but think that it wasn't just discussed. I wonder whether before very long we'll be seeing the Iranians placing orders for Russian equipment and Russian-built ships. But anyway, that's no doubt all pending in the future. So we have quite a lot of diplomatic activity. Note that it is all coming from the Russian side. Now, the Russians, for their part, have commented on some of these proposals to sort of freeze the conflict. And the Russians, these are comments which have been made now from Washington. I discussed this article in Politico. There seems to be an emerging consensus that is going to be, before very long, the objective that the United States, or at least the administration, is going to be seeking. The British, as shown by Sunak's comments in the House of Commons a day or so ago, aren't happy, but this does seem to be what the British now want to do. But, rather, the Americans want to do, that they want to freeze the conflict. But the Russians are pouring increasing amounts of cold water on this idea. Lavrov has already spoken out against it, and now we've had comments from Peskov, Putin's spokesman. And Peskov has said Russia considers only the following opportunity of ending the special military operation. It secures Russia's interest and achieves Russia's goals, either in the course of the special military operation or by other available means. In other words, a diplomatic settlement that fulfills all of the Russian demands made both at the start of the conflict and, by the way, its underlying security concerns, a reformatting of the security architecture in Europe. And Peskov apparently said that it was too early to say which one of the proposed settlement roadmaps would be preferable to Russia. He said that it's too early to speak about it. No prerequisites for a peace process are yet in place, evidently, and the special military operation continues. And he rather facetiously said that when people in the West say that they don't want the conflict to become a frozen one, he said that Russia is in solidarity with that sentiment. In other words, in solidarity with people like Scholz, who has also said it, and of course Sunak, which of course, he's teasing. So the Russians are not going to go for the frozen conflict idea. If anybody in Washington hopes they will, I'm confident that they will be disillusioned, and the reports, the glimmers of reports we're getting from the meeting between Xi Jinping and Mishustin, they all point in the same direction, that the Chinese too are not looking to freeze the conflict. They too want a sustained peace, which will have to be a peace on Russian terms. And that's the objective that the Chinese also are going to work towards. Now, before I finish this video, I do want to touch on certain really very fine articles that have appeared. The first is one that has been written by Ray McGovern, former CIA analyst, head of the Russia analytical section within the CIA, expert on Sino-Russian and Sino-Soviet relations, the man who provided the daily brief to the president, person who, by the way, I've come increasingly to consider a friend. I hope I'm not going too far there in saying that. As I said, we have become well acquainted with each other, and he is somebody I have a huge respect and admiration for. And McGovern has written, I think, an excellent piece in response to that letter from the various diplomats and security people that appeared in the New York Times, by the way, as a paid advertisement, which tells you something about the resistance even these senior people have to encounter in order to get their views across. Anyway, that important letter I discussed in a program recently in which these former senior officials said that the war in Ukraine has been a mitigated disaster. It has been to a great extent provoked by Western action, and that the only way out of this conflict, which avoids a debacle and massive loss of life and further destruction, is through a diplomatic process which takes Russian security concerns into account. But that letter did include that, I have to say, this ritual condemnation of the Russian decision to launch the special military operation, saying that this was, in effect, a illegal act, a criminal act, things like this. And Ray McGovern in this article says, well, I understand that. I understand why people might be saying that. But if they do think that this was an illegal and criminal act, as they say, and if they also say that the Russians had other options, we need to at least have some idea what those other options were. What were those options that the Russians had in February 2022, other than start the special military operation, which they did not follow, and which makes that operation criminal and illegal? And McGovern makes the entirely valid point that the letter doesn't tell us what those options are. Now, I have encountered this issue myself. I've had many interactions with people who said this. Some of them have been private interactions. One important one, which appeared on a program for the Duran, we didn't dwell on it there, but I noticed that Noam Chomsky, for example, also said this thing, that the Russian action was illegal and criminal, though not unprovoked. On the contrary, it had been provoked. Well, that, again, implies, or so it seems to me, that there must have been alternative options for the Russians to follow, given the provocation and given the threat to Russian security, which people like Chomsky and many others who make this argument all concede. So I just asked this question. I mean, McGovern asks it, and I join with him. If the people who say this, who accept that there was extreme provocation, think that the Russians had other options, they need to tell us more clearly what those other options were. I say that because I come back to the point I made at the start of this program. The Biden administration habitually lies. We've just seen this with this raid on Belgorod, made with American equipment, contrary to all those false promises that American weapons would not be used in attacks on Russia itself. So that, it seems to me, already narrows any diplomatic options available to the Russians before the war began. Informal agreements, promises from the US that Ukraine would not join NATO, for example. One can completely understand why from the Russians, coming from that particular source might not cut it. Anyway, I am interested to know the answer to that question, because I've asked it, as I said, in private discussions myself. I've never had an answer, and I've seen and commend Ray McGovern for putting the question publicly, and I will be interested to see whether that answer eventually comes. Now, there's also been a fine article by Jeffrey Sachs, who, by the way, was a signatory to that letter, and Jeffrey Sachs makes the absolutely essential point that in order to achieve peace, the overriding issue for the Russians of NATO enlargement needs to be addressed. Unless Western leaders are finally willing to grasp that point and to address that point in a way that the Russians will find satisfactory and which will deliver to them security guarantees that they can trust, prospects for peace in this conflict in Ukraine are remote. And I have to say that I don't see any prospects for peace at all, because for the moment, no one in the West seems to be willing to accept this reality that NATO enlargement has been the cause of this entire crisis. Well, the third article I want to commend is one by Eve Smith on naked capitalism. It's a complex and lengthy article, which I'm going to come back to in another program, this video having gone on now for a very long time. But in it, Eve Smith makes the point that in so much discussion that is now going on between Western governments and amongst Western officials about the conflict in Ukraine, you get the increasing impression that Western officials and political leaders are now simply talking to each other and are becoming increasingly detached from the facts on the ground. It's what they say to each other that is becoming more real to them than the actual events. And that is incredibly dangerous. And it, to some extent, I think, goes back to the latest plan, the freezing the conflict idea, which is unreal, but seems to be emerging in the United States as the various officials there essentially negotiate with each other. Anyway, it's a complex article by Eve Smith. I'm going to definitely come back to it in my next program. I'm going to finish there. Long program. Thank you for your patience if you've come all the way through. More from me soon. Just to remind you again, you can find all of our programs on our various platforms: Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin, and Telegram. You can also find you can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Links under this video. Don't forget also to check our shop. Get yourself the amazing things that you will find there: our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel.